We still have, gosh, we have 4 minutes by my watch.
Ukraine is the worst.
Current events.
That's why I'd like to see who's ready to their
Oh, current events started, what, 18 months ago, and I think we were 5 people. We're 21 right now, and that I think is sufficient to call it a quorum. What I would like to do today is make this primarily an open discussion about Ukraine and some of the implications that roll out from that. What I'd like to do, if it's all right, I've asked Sally Ann to write something that she could read for us to reflect on before we start talking. Are you ready, Sal? Please.
Good morning. For just a moment this morning, let us walk in another man's shoes. Bertrand Russell said, "War does not determine who is right, only who is left." Kneeling in freezing snow, praying for their lives, fleeing their homes, hiding in subways, begging God for safety. Ukrainians are facing the greed of an advancing despot. The cost of human life will be large. The economic impact will be crippling. The destructive ravages of war will linger for years to come. Why? We ask, why? Just imagine yourselves, and really imagine this, gathering a handful, just a handful of belongings, as you and your beloved families run and hide from the terror of advancing tanks. The shrill of air raid sirens echoing throughout your homeland, planting in you excruciating fear and panic. You are robbed of your freedom in a few harsh seconds. You have done nothing to provoke such an attack on your country, your personhood, your very souls. You will suffer pain and loss. Your tears will flood your heart. You are stripped of dignity and hope and even the right to live. What can possibly be accomplished in the quest for power and control? Is there ever reason for such an unprovoked attack? Is anything ever gained by human devastation and destruction? Will authoritarianism become the new world order? Will the ground of war be stained red forever with the blood of innocent human beings?
Just sit for a minute and reflect on that and reflect on our own experience of Ukraine, more war. As we did on the Friday after the January 6th insurrection, what I thought we'd do today is just have an open discussion. So, anything anyone wants to say about Ukraine or the implications of Ukraine, where it's going, how it ends. Sue.
I read somewhere that the economy in Russia is so severely pinched that many soldiers are walking away. How long is it going to take before they realize they're not going to get paid? And that they're sacrificing their lives for Putin with no recompense?
Kept long. Bud, you raise your hand. Sal, right here. Come on.
Just what I mentioned earlier is that to a large degree, I think what happens here will be a precursor for what happens to Taipei and the Chinese, depending on what happens to Russia in terms of this inversion.
Absolutely. I think it's very perceptive and tragically true. But isn't this almost a license to any other despot, whether it's Xi in China or even some of the authoritarian leaders in NATO countries, to say authoritarianism is obviously the best way to go. Jenny? Sal? Jenny? Go ahead.
I agree with every single word Sally Ann said. And I wonder if this gives us an opportunity to reflect on some of the incursions that we have made. And it has been called helping the other people, lots of other rationalizations. But the fact of the matter is we bought guns and bombs and planes, and we've slaughtered citizens of so many countries. And I wish we would reflect on our behavior then and consider our behavior in the future.
Well said. Doug?
First, I was just going to comment on.
Bill, can you turn it to face Don's mouth?
I was just going to comment on soldiers not being paid. For soldiers that are in a combat zone, in active combat, there is no place to spend money. Either whatever is available, the military provides, if it's not available. So it's a non-monetary situation. Now, with respect to dependents, that would be different. If you have dependents that are getting allowance from your military pay, and they're not getting paid, that is a factor.
Do you know what's happening in Russia, Doug?
I don't know.
Are the dependents being paid?
That I don't know. I was also going to comment, in 1994, with the breakup of the Soviet Union, the Ukraine found themselves as the owners of nuclear weapons. As a result of that, they entered into agreement, I think it was in the United States, the United Kingdom, and I don't know if Germany was in there or not. Russia was also in there. The Ukraine agreed that they would relinquish their nuclear weapons with a compact of essentially defense by the signers of that document in 1994.
I heard Zelensky talk about that, I guess, 2 or 3 days ago, that I gave up my nuclear weapons, should the United States be doing more? Kinetically, should we send troops? Is that anything that makes sense?
Well, for somebody that was actually in Vietnam, I'm inclined to say no with respect to troops. To the extent that the Ukrainians are prepared to sacrifice lives in their own defense, that's a different question. I think we should be doing more than we were doing. One thing that we're not doing is Russia is basically a non-Arab federal state. One thing the United States has done in the last couple of years is given up our energy independence. Now, with respect to LNG, liquefied natural gas, as far as I know, all available LNG ships are in fact either unloading in Europe or en route to Europe. And we can basically replace the natural gas that Europe has been getting from Russia. But we were in a position there several years ago being able to actually do some exporting of petroleum products, which is going to be more difficult now.
I hear this often, the issue on energy, the hydrocarbon supply. And two questions I haven't answered personally and researched on. First is, energy independence means we're no longer dependent upon energy supplies from outside the United States. Has that changed? Are we now, as a result of the Biden administration this last year, are we now suddenly importing energy?
Well, independence is a vague term because even when we were, quote, energy independent, we were exporting crude and importing refined products, or the reverse. So it is integrated with the world economy.
Yeah. But I think, Don, you want to comment on that too? Ray?
As far as I know, we were buying actually oil from Russia. The figure was quoted, I think, in the Wall Street yesterday. And I think the facts of the matter are, we've got to get the administration to let us open up our oil facilities and get on with being more independent and being able to supply our friends with that. I think that's what it's all about.
I want to go back and again, if somebody here could research. In the old days, I had an assistant, I'd say, we should check that out. Somebody, golden somebody in our careers. The two questions in my mind are to think further on that. What does it mean to be independent? And how much crude were we actually, was it crude we're buying from the Soviets or the Russians? Or is it refined products we're buying from the Russians? And were we doing so because we didn't have it? I thought we have been really quite independent for a few years now. So that's one research question. The second research question, and I should know more about this than I do, maybe somebody here. You think about replacing the pipe gas from Russia, and there are, I think, 4 active pipelines today, not counting Nord Stream 2. 3 may be active, and Nord Stream would be the 4th. But here, I do know, pipe gas is way less expensive than regassed LNG. In our case, pipe gas to LNG facilities, liquefaction facilities, make them liquid so that they can be shipped, and then regas when it gets to Europe. It's expensive. And the relative cost of U.S. gas delivered in Europe versus Russian gas delivered in Europe is something I'd like to look at. And again, not price, because price is set globally, but cost. Are the Russians delivering that gas to Europe at a cost can they deliver it much less expensively than we can? And to me, I think that's a very important question. Charlie?
My question has to do with sanctions. Have they ever worked? North Korea, Iran, sanctions, they still go on doing what they're doing. I have to think that Putin has been planning this for a number of years to get Russia back where he thinks that they belong. And he has to have thought of every sanction that we can put against him. I mean, there can be no surprises for what we're going to do. So the question is, how well prepared is he to withstand these sanctions that we're doing?
I think it's a very good question. And two, one of them is, in general, do sanctions work? But I also go back to what Jenny said. In general, have wars worked quite well? And I would say our history of war since 1945 is not something to be proud of. Almost every single war we've either lost, walked away from, or really left a country destitute. I don't know that Afghanistan is happy that we came there to fight for their freedom today. Syria, Vietnam, there's another big one in there that I'm missing. Oh, that was a very big success. So, and then that brings up the question, as between countries, and that's another issue, the concept of Westphalian sovereignty. Do you all know what that is? The Treaty of Westphalia is what created nation states. And that treaty said we will respect the rights of other nation states, among, not just we, but nation states will respect the rights of each other. And a violation of Westphalia, and that's what, 200 or 300 years ago, a violation of that treaty is essentially what Russia's doing again now. But it's involved in this whole question of what kind of a world are we going to live in? Will might and military capability be the dominant factor? Is that a better, is the alternative financial dominance, which we've had? Bill?
Something that's been a question to me, and I think I know the answer, but where is the United Nations? We know that Russia and China both can veto anything, but it would seem that some nation, including the United States, would bring up a motion, even though it may not pass, to condemn Russia. But as far as I know, that hasn't happened.
Well, I think that's, first of all, it's an interesting idea. The history of our condemnation making a difference in the lives of people over the last, since the United Nations formed is not a good history. You know, so what? I've been condemned by the United Nations. But question, we've got NATO, we've got the European Union, we've got the United Nations. There are several international bodies. Sadly, you know, are they trumped? No, fine. By Westphalia? Can we reach agreements but still have to respect, so we can't invade, we can't attack Russia because that would be a violation of sovereignty, and do so just because they attacked Ukraine. What more can we? I agree totally with Charlie. I think sanctions are essentially built into the thinking of every despot. I've forgotten your name. Help me, John. Henry.
There have been reports that the rulers in Ukraine are themselves authoritarians and without the precepts of democracy. If that is so, are we looking at a fight between thieves?
A very good observation. And you think about where are the despots around the world today? I mean, we think of Xi and Putin because the states are larger, although China is just massively larger, and I think, Bud suggested this earlier, potentially a much bigger problem than Ukraine. But also Poland. I'm sorry, go ahead.
But why is it always our job to do this? It's really the job of the NATO participants to take charge of this. And Biden is trying to gather NATO participants together to do this. At least Germany has cut off the pipeline from Russia, which is apparently a very big thing. That it was supplying most of the gas to Germany, and they've cut that off, which is a big sacrifice for them. I think it's time the European countries sacrificed. Why is it always our job to go in and do it?
The question is very good, although I think if you do the research, there are other pipelines supplying Germany from Russia that haven't been touched. Nord Stream amplified the supply, but it wasn't the source of the supply that mattered. One of the big issues with sanctions right now is like the SWIFT Accord. The Germans are saying, not just the Germans, but they lead the pack, it's nasty what they're doing in Ukraine, but don't make our lives difficult. Don?
Well, I'm just going to say that we're the big boy on the block, and everybody looks to us to straighten, to calm things down, or to deal with the problems of the world. And we, as I say, are currently we were the biggest boy on the block. There's other, now finally, like China coming along, there's another big boy on the block. But when you're in that situation and you don't have a global governance type of being that has to deal with things like this, and until you ever get to that kind of point, somebody is going to be putting their fingers in everybody else's pie just to get involved and try to straighten things out and be blamed for the outcome. Yes, the United States has tucked its nose into all sorts of things around the world, which somebody had to do something. And as I say, if you're the big boy on the block, you're the one that's stuck with the job. And if nobody else is going to do it, you can't sit back and let it happen.
Although the last 6 years have been essentially a program of disengagement. We shouldn't be the world's policeman. And you know, I'm so torn on this because I look at Vietnam, Iraq, Afghanistan and say that wasn't a very successful job of policing. Should we? I've often said about NATO, we're talking about now, well, we can't go into Ukraine because they're not part of NATO. Are we really prepared to do a world war for Estonia? But, and then we'll go to Gordon. That first button.
I think one of the problems that exists is that you have to acknowledge that might makes right regardless of how you crank it out. And the two biggest armament people in the past, besides ourselves, have been Germany and Japan. And right now, they have been stopped from building back up anything that resembles a strong military presence, which means that we are the only people with a strong military presence that can talk to these people. And if we had two more allies, one way or the other, it would be very helpful to remove the constraints on armament so that at least there are other boys with arms that can be talked to.
Yeah, it's an interesting question, I think, for a long time, I've talked before about the Council on Foreign Relations. One of the positions of the Council has always been the United States as a global policeman is infinitely better than a group of heavily armed countries. Recently, we sort of said, yeah, we don't want to be the world's policeman. You guys ought to spend more money on your military, have more arms. Gordon? I don't know if that works.
I haven't seen or heard what China has said about what has just happened and in Russia's position. The potential impact on the world economy and therefore on China, it could be enormous. And it would be very interesting to see and to know what what China thinks of all of this.
Yeah, it goes back to what Bud said earlier. I think that's an ominous silence from China.
They want to do the same thing.
I think they're waiting to see what happens in Ukraine, and right after that, come on Taiwan. And if we do nothing about Ukraine, and again, I'm personally very torn on whether we should do anything. Did somebody have their hand up back here? What other than sanctions, which I agree are just so iffy in terms of their impact, supplying the people in Ukraine, the Ukraine population with more weapons, does that mean we think just more weapons somewhere? One wonders, for years, Bertrand Russell, who started the thing about war is not who's right, the victory is somebody who's left, was a major disarmament advocate, as you probably all know. I really believe that is the better course than, oh, I know the solution to Ukraine, let's just give them more military armament. The arms makers benefit. I don't know that the world does. Not all at once. Jacques?
I think I agree with you. I mean, disarmament is better than piling up armaments. But that's not the way we go right now. And I like the observation made by Bud a minute ago. We forget that when we speak of Europe and when we speak of China, we forget that two of the main nations, Japan and Germany, could not fight properly. Germany, to speak about Germany, which is very close to Russia, has no nuclear armament. I am not for arming Germany, but I wonder what Putin would think if he had not too far from Russia, a country like Germany with nuclear arms. I think that he would think twice.
Again, then essentially what we're saying is that the post-war kind of agreement of mad, mutually assured destruction, neither the Soviet Union then or the United States would use their nuclear armaments because we know nobody comes out of this thing alive. Does mutually assured destruction, is that the best solution for a global polity? That all of us have enough nuclear weapons to destroy everybody? Sooner or later, some damn fool is going to head one of those countries and use them. I don't think Putin goes that far, but who knows? Is he the fool? And if he succeeds with conventional weapons, as he's certainly found to in Ukraine, the problem, I think, for their expansion is even Moldova. I was looking at that the other day. How many of you here have been to Moldova? Good for you, Jacques. I don't even know any Moldavians or whatever they are. They're part of NATO. Will we go to war with with Russia if they were to move from the Ukraine into Moldova? How many of you here would support our doing so? Or the Baltic states? Would you, well, happily, Jacques, you're as old as I am, you're not going to carry a gun. But I would not want my sons and daughters to go to war to defend Moldova. I'll be very clear about that. Jacques?
I think you're right. I mean, I would hesitate from seeing things from here. But things are not going to happen in Moldova if it's not something which involves a lot more problems around Moldova and which will push the NATO and the European nation to help themselves to help Moldova. In that case, you'd be forced by the Treaty of NATO, Article 5, to follow.
There's no question. Article 5 compels us, whether it's Moldova, Estonia, Lithuania, Latvia, any of those smaller countries that are part of NATO, Article 5 says we go to war for them. And I suppose that's had some deterrent effect. And maybe had we allowed Ukraine into NATO, that would have been a sufficient deterrent to keep the Russians at home. I don't know. Let's talk for a minute, if it's all right, about the implications on China. I think the silence is deafening. I had really, frankly, expected Xi to come out against this nation-to-nation aggression. And I'm saddened and a little surprised that he's been quiet. And I think it's because he's saying, I'm going to wait and see what happens here because Taiwan is so similar, or even more similar. Don?
I was just going to say, Taiwan, I think, is a bit different in the sense that we can physically help Taiwan directly. You can put the Pacific Fleet between Taiwan and China if you wanted to. I don't know that we want to, but it's much more easily defended by the United States than Ukraine is.
It's a good point. But also there's the one China policy that we sort of respect mainland China to honor, will not recognize Taiwan if they won't invade. We'll go with Charlie first and then Caroline.
We're not in a war yet, but we may be. And my question is Biden a wartime president? Does he have what it takes to do what you have to do when you're in a war? And I think there are wartime presidents, and I think there are peacetime presidents. They're different people. They grew up differently. They have different thoughts, different ideas of what to do. But, you know, we never knew a wartime president like Harry Truman, what he did. And there's an example. Who knew?
Who knew? That's what I was just going to say.
We don't know what Biden is capable of doing if we reach the wartime. And that disturbs me.
I'm going to come back to that. Caroline?
I just researched what China is saying so far, and it goes from everything from they are in surprise at the invasion, which is ridiculous, to that they are very neutral about the invasion, and they are also blaming the United States.
Yep.
And they refuse to call it an invasion.
Yeah.
So far, China
That's not good.
is staying very neutral so far.
Yeah, it's not good. Now I'm trying, hey, Charlie, what did you say? Remind me if I had an answer to that. I want to.
Wartime president.
You know, one of the problems Biden has, I think, and everybody knows that I'm not going to tell you who I voted for, but you can guess. His problem, I think, is that he's our age. And even before he was our age, he had a little problem speaking. He'd stumble or misspeak. Didn't mean he was a dumb president or a stupid senator. He just had a little problem speaking. If you look at his actions, I believe, in terms of the sanctions and his response to what's going on in Ukraine, not how he's presented it, because how he's presented it, each time I see him, I say, I love you, but good Lord, you can't answer a question without stumbling over the answer. But what he's doing, not what he's saying, what he's doing, I think is pretty right. Subject to this whole question of do we allow nations to attack other nations and only sanction them without something else? And I'm not sure I'm in favor of something else either. How many of you here would be comfortable, would support the idea of going to war over Ukraine, putting our troops there? Charlie's finger goes up. He put 2 troops there, not the whole battalion. But I think your sentiments are, I think they're right. I don't think many people here have a big hunger to go to war for Ukraine or anybody else.
I guess, what I'm kind of wondering about is why did he go to Ukraine? And from my understanding, a little bit I've read, is that he went into Ukraine because he's protecting the oil or gas, whatever, the gas line or something about the Ukraine. And Russia seems to already be economically in a bad situation. So the sanctions, to me, would be, if we could push on the economics of going on in Russia. But then again, from what I understand, for us to do even worse sanctions affects us and Europe and all the other economies. So, that's, to me, what you look at is why did he go into the Ukraine? Because to me, he would go into the Ukraine wanting it back because it was originally part of the Soviet Union anyway. It's a little different than us, him going in,
the China going into Taiwan. I don't know if China going into Taiwan is really affecting their economy, or, you know, it's more of an on kind of thing.
You know, I'd be curious to know, I did not think, and I don't know the answer to this, that there were pipelines going through Ukraine supplying Russian gas to Europe. There are, but they've never been in any kind of threat, have they? It's not as though he's going to protect the open pipelines. I don't know. I thought this was purely an act to say it was wrong to break up the Soviet Union 25 years ago. I've been saying all along I was going to try to get it back, and this is step one. It had nothing to do with the economics of a pipeline going through Ukraine. I could be wrong.
I read that somewhere, but they know more.
I think that's a fabrication of reasons. My excuse for going there is I thought they were doing this because they were trying to stamp out Nazism in Ukraine. Jacques again?
I don't remember when, and I did not pay that much attention to it at the time, but there has been problems between about oil between Moscow and Kiev, in the past. I would have to go back and read it, but there has been some problem about Russia cutting the gas to the Ukrainians. They didn't like it, of course. But I cannot tell you when.
We need to look more into that. But again, in my own view, I think that I go back to Australia. Because I'm unhappy about the way some government is handling my gas supply is not a reason to go to war. We've agreed nation states don't go to war with each other, full stop. You negotiate, you enter into treaties, you change the treaties, but you don't go to war. The problem in part is we may say that, but there's a group out there called arms manufacturers and suppliers who are saying, nonetheless, let's make sure everybody has enough weaponry to do nasty things. How could we ever back off this weapons supply? Maybe make our response to Ukraine or other countries not, in the case of Germany, for example, there's a big push to rearm Germany almost to the level of World War II. Why? Because we don't want to be the world's policeman. I'm not altogether sure I want Germany to be a large nuclear power. I would want Poland to be a nuclear power, another despot, or Hungary, another despot. And yet, if we say we're pulling back and we'll never act, except if you want to buy weapons from us, we'll supply you with weapons, is that the right solution? But, and then I'll come back to Henry. Let's go Henry first.
The United States has developed armed forces without parallel in the history of the world. This is a situation that is the result of a depression within the United States during the 30s that was cured by becoming a military power. And there is nothing that will prevent the United States from being less than a superpower.
I think you're right. And the idea that the Depression didn't end because of the intelligence of the Roosevelt administration. It ended because we had to rearm, and that meant reemploy. Bud?
When I said rearming, I wasn't necessarily thinking of nuclear. I was thinking of more conventional forces, since almost everybody seems reluctant to even consider using nuclear forces. But if you had some tanks and other equipment available, it would be a lot better deterrent than having almost nothing available. The other thing I want to mention one of the things I've seen and read is that one of Russia's problems is here is Ukraine with a much higher standard of living for its people right next door as a democratic state, as opposed to the Russian people in general who have a much lower standard of living and can see their neighbors living under something that Moscow says is wrong, sort of proving that it isn't wrong.
I think you're right. It goes back to these questions of how, if you were a Russian today and you looked at a better lifestyle in Ukraine, which is less than an even better lifestyle in Germany. But again, is the solution to my envy to go to war with you? How sad. But I think that's very possibly
One factor, I think there are a number of factors, but that is one of them.
Oh, I think you're right. I think you're right. Somebody saw another hand up over here. Would we go to war for Taiwan? I think not. Don is saying no. Would anybody here support our...
I suspect that what we might do is make China go to war with us by putting forces like this,
Putting the fleet between
the fleet, and then just say, come at us. And I don't know if they would do that, but they might.
It's a game of, a dangerous game.
Yeah, it is.
I think it is a mistake to consider China and Russia as equal partners. There is a significant difference in their modus operandi and the idea that China is an aggressive, militant entity is still not proven.
Yeah, I agree with that. My sense of China is that they're not an aggressive, acquisitive nation. The only reason they might have a desire to go into Taiwan is because they think that they're part of China, but we've agreed to say that, as long as they can go over there and produce. How do we resolve this? Let's assume for a moment in the next 3 days, and I think it's likely to be that time frame. Kyiv falls. I fear for Zelensky and his family. Are they going to leave the country and try to find some safety? Are they going to be brave and stay there and lose their lives? Nonetheless, I think this thing will be over in less than a week or two. And what happens then? Do we just say New World Order? Now Ukraine is, like Belarus, just part of the Soviet orbit? Are we going to do something to try to change that? I agree with Jenny. The answer is probably not, and probably shouldn't. Now, if you lived in Ukraine, how would your life be different if you had a different man sitting in the seat of power who happens to be a Soviet stooge or a Russian stooge? But how is that going to make life different? Are they going to have different jobs? Are the people who left going to go back? Are they going to stay outside? How will life be different in a Russian Ukraine? Any thoughts? Bill?
Don't you think, based on some of the information we've gotten, is that they're going to fight like hell against the aggressor? I mean, in other words, you're somewhat in terms of a resurgent, very strong Ukrainian people who are going to resist the Soviets, however that might happen. So,
I don't know how many of you watched these pictures of the tanks when they started to go into Ukraine from Russia. One of the TV shots or the pictures of that was a Mazda car parked on the corner of the road as the tanks drove by. The problem I have with Ukraine's strong resistance is that they're going after tanks with Mazdas. They'll fight hard for another few days. But good Lord, the might of the Russians in the last few days, it is moved into Ukraine is really scary, Jenny.
I mean, this is a war of futility for the Ukrainians, and they should try and get out with as little damage and loss of life as possible. And I think we forget that every single one of our forefathers were immigrants from countries that they didn't like to be in. And this is a painful situation. This is difficult. There's tons of them, but they have options. And if the option is doing something that's really, really painful, excruciatingly so, or dying, I take the option to do the excruciatingly difficult thing to do.
I couldn't agree more. And among other things, I gotta tell you, if you were to raise the subject of immigration again, I'd love to have a lot of Ukrainian immigrants come into this country. They're talented, they're literate, they're capable. They would significantly enhance our economy. I don't think that's going to happen. But I think you're right. I think they're going to say, do I want to die or do I want to live under a Russian stooge? They'll say, I'm going to live. And thus the resistance, I think it'll end badly. I think those who do resist are going to end up slightly disappeared. We're not going to know much about it, but they'll clean house as they come in, but otherwise I think it's just going to end badly, but end. Ken?
2 points. I think there is one sanction that would work that I believe Biden would like to put in, but I don't think the Europeans are allowing it. And that's the SWIFT banking system. That would cut off all money coming in to Russia from oil. That's the big revenue right now. And by the way, the Nord Stream pipe number 2, that's not even in operation yet, so that's a non-issue. But on a bigger point, there's a lot of speculation about what's in Putin's mind. You know, you hear it all the time. What's he thinking about? Well, I think it was within the past year he's written a 5,000-word position paper. His object is not oil. He's obsessed with the Soviet Union. That's what he wanted. That's what he was. He was a KGB officer. That's the kind of guy he was. And I'm going to bring in politics here. I don't need to be nitpicking on any one party or anything, because I know all politicians, U.S. politicians, say things. Putin hears everything we say. He knows everything. And in my opinion, and every politician has said, you could name several after what I'm going to say. But I do believe that when he was listening to the debate that went on between Obama and Romney, and Romney brought up Russia as being one of our biggest opponents, and Obama put him down on it. I think Putin must have been sitting in Moscow right then and saying, who the hell does that guy think he is? To think. And what happened right after that, frankly? Crimea? That happened right after that. And the other thing, and I respect Biden, but his team is the same team that was in with Obama. And I'm not sure that they're the wartime kind of people.
You know, it's so hard to put oneself in another man's shoes here. In '94, Obama was president, and it was then that Crimea took place, wasn't it? What did we do then? I've forgotten. Can anybody just refresh? Basically, he said that's not a thing to do.
The sanctions that were immaterial.
But again, would the better course of action been to go to war in 1994? I got to tell you, and I'm not totally sure that there's a major difference between the two parties or the leadership of the two parties on this issue. I don't think Trump would have taken us into war. I don't think that the Republican leadership in a Republican-dominated Senate or House would take us to war. I think they'd still talk sanctions, but I don't know, am I wrong here? Do you all think that Trump would have been a more belligerent wartime power and that would have stopped Putin? John?
I'm not sure I understand what you mean about war, because nobody here, including me or anyone like me, wants war. We're not talking about war when we talk about arming ourselves. I mean, when you attack, you've got to defend yourself. It's a natural response. And it does not mean that you're going to shot immediately the guy within minutes, but you got to protect yourself. And I think we could have done so much more before Christmas. And way back, I think it goes back to October, when Putin was acting the way he did and sent the documents menacing this and that if we didn't do this and that. So war, I mean, getting armed, it's a way not to attack, but to, in that case, but to protect ourselves. And I think that if NATO and the Europeans and held by the Americans had sent as many troops on the border of the western Ukraine, maybe then Putin would have thought it over. But as we didn't do anything much but talking, well, of course, he took over.
Yeah, I kind of think he called our bluff on that. He basically said, I don't think anybody's going to do anything if I invade. Again, the SWIFT sanction, I think, would be a great idea. And that, I think, would probably bring this thing to an end in a hurry. Because the Europeans can't live long without Russian hydrocarbons. And SWIFT would stop that like that. But I think it's the Germans primarily, and maybe the French, who are saying no to the SWIFT, isn't it? Aren't they the ones saying to, you know? And again, do we like a concerted action, and which means we don't do things without our allies being in concert with us, or do we act alone? If we've got a situation like the current situation, and 2 or 3 of the NATO members are saying, don't go too far because we need the energy, should we ignore them? Or should we respect that NATO agreement? And thus far, I think we've been respecting it. And frankly, if you look at the 2 governments, now as political as Charlie and Ken were, I think that the previous administration's antipathy toward NATO and toward alliances was not very healthy. I think what we've seen now is a pretty strong NATO. But what we've also seen is the futility of treaties to stop a military madman. Who's willing to go to war and for what today? We've got 5 minutes left, and there may be other current problems that are interesting. Or not interesting. Ray.
I think it's a fact that we have been buying 151 million barrels of gas, oil, from Russia every single day, including yesterday and today.
Who's buying that gas? We are?
Yes. Because we're not producing enough on ourselves and we need it. And nobody's faced up to the fact that all we had to basically do was become a producer again. Not a big deal.
Unfortunately, I don't have data at hand, but I'm going to certainly research it. I go back to the question I asked much earlier. Are we really importing a lot of natural gas from Russia today in the United States? It's being liquefied and sent here and regassed to come in the United States?
Oil. Not gas.
We're exporting gas, importing oil.
Right.
Interesting. And the oil is used just as a...
It depends on which challenge you're looking at. That's come out.
Oh, which channel?
I You're not watching the right
I'm
news.
not watching Fox, so I don't know about that yet.
What's happening is they're opening the shale fields back up, which they closed down because it was more expensive oil. So there is the ability to get the oil, it's just the cost. And $100 a barrel is worthwhile opening it back up.
But it's making a very interesting point. If the price of oil stays at $100, you better believe we're going to get more shale oil. But not be, I think, and again, I'm watching the wrong channel. I thought that we produced that oil at $100 to export, not because we're dependent upon anybody else's oil or gas today. I want to run that down. You're all saying that currently we need Russian oil to refine into gas and other products here that we might have produced. I'll tell you what, we wouldn't produce it from new oil fields, opening up the reserve places elsewhere. It's going to take years before that hydrocarbon hits the market.
It's mainly a cost factor. You could buy it cheaper than you could produce it in the shale fields.
So, yeah, I mean, shale oil is expensive to produce. And if I'm a shale producer, by the way, I am absolutely delighted that we're having problems in Europe. Price of oil goes up. By the way, Russia's not doing badly at $100 a barrel either. And that makes me nervous to think that U.S. hydrocarbon companies would nudge us toward, or nudge the Europeans toward this kind of problem because it increases the price of oil and gas.
President Biden can show the wisdom of Solomon if he's smart, if he's capable, in next week's State of the Union. That's going to be a real challenge to state that State of the Union. Because a lot of us think it's terrible right now. I'm talking about the southern border, in my opinion. But other than inflation, etc. But he's going to have, he's a challenge there to talk frankly, not BS, not typical political stuff. And it's a real challenge what he's going to say. I wish him well.
Yeah, and again, I love him to death. He could have the wisdom of Solomon. The speech could be perfect, and he missed a few words. But we should go with the speech that he might have said, not how he says it. Again, is on that other channel that some of you watch, the southern border is a bigger issue than Russians coming into Ukraine. But is that because there are these MS-13 drug dealers coming across the southern border in droves? We're led to believe that in some news sources. I want to run that down at the same time I'm running down our dependence upon Russian oil. Carol Lee?
According to Forbes, the United States imported more gasoline and other refined petroleum products from Russia than any other country in 2021, which makes it very tricky for President Biden I'm trying to read this. This makes it very tricky for President Biden and the United States to maneuver as it attempts to impose restrictions on U.S. imports to Russia in the wake of President Vladimir Putin's invasion. So we do import. This is Forbes.
Yeah, Forbes, though, you got a question. No, I'm joking. I guess one of the things that, and I say this as an old energy guy, I don't think we have spigots that we turn on and off. If Biden's hydrocarbon policies in the last 12 months, it's 12 months next week for a State of the Union, if he's been able to weaken our energy economy so much that over the last 12 months we've become dependent upon Russian hydrocarbons, I personally would be very surprised. I just don't think you shut it down or turn it on that fast. Ray, I see you disagree with me. I'm sorry?
You're going to be very surprised. Our daily production is down over 2 million barrels a day from the Trump administration to now. 2 million barrels.
Because of regulations that the Biden administration has put in place? I'll spend more time on your channel.
There you go.
The problem with fracking is when they frack a well, it's got high production for a relatively short period of time. It's not a long extended produce, so they have to keep drilling and fracking, They've stopped the new drilling and the production's going down.
And they stopped the new drilling as a consequence of government action in the last 12 months. It's now, thank God, 11 o'clock, because I'm going to get in trouble, but I think that's a very important thing to spend some time talking about. How dependent upon are we upon foreign sources of hydrocarbons, and what can be done about that? I'll go to your channel. I'll even look at Forbes. And I'll do all of that between now and next week. Sally Ann, you want to say something?
Well, I just wanted to comment on something that Ken said, which is not only this oil issue and so forth and so on, which I don't understand it too deeply, but that Putin himself is such an egomaniac. He has such an enormous ego, and one of the things I believe in his desire to kind of restructure his legacy to be one of the great czars of Russia. He's trying to bring all that back. I think that's as important to him as almost anything. And he's, what are we going to do about just one man? I mean, the Russians didn't want to do this. So what do we do about one man, one leader who is so egomaniacal that he's crazy, really, to do something like this? And involve not only people in the military, but civilians are hiding in subways in Ukraine, cheap by Gerald, hiding to not to be killed. They're just civilians, just people.
On that happy note, we'll see you next week, and I'm actually bringing books and sources from oil producers daily. And I'll either come next week prepared to battle or chastened. See you then.